Autopsy doctors have read it. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with his friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing, so we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in. But we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to bag him with a face mask, the patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun at the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all, and the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. My wife is a pathologist assistant, and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term, and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity, and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery, the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver that caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point, now has no interest. Masters in Forensic Pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that had life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy, the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain, then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances, though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown-out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy, until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck, and into the chest. That was pretty wild. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter, we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The penis was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. Edit. I remember another one. In my final year of training, we had a cadaver lab to practice advanced airway management techniques, e.g., difficult intubations, cricothyroidotomy, etc. While I was helping an intern do a basic intubation, she commented the tube wouldn't pass. I think she had some kind of growth or mass in her airway. I took a look, asked for some forceps, and pulled a half-eaten hot dog out of her larynx. It of course had been embalmed along with the rest of her. Cause of death, identified. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese, with muscles half the size of any other cadaver. Her pectoral muscles were paper thin, to get some reference. We figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started our neurology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tank mates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification, and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair-bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interested dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and 1,000,000 thanks aren't enough. I have more stories if anyone is curious. Edit. I should add that her granddaughter made a point of saying this lady did not hold a grudge on her brother, and they lived full lives on happy terms. While in medical school, we had to observe an autopsy and could assist. One of the lectures was to observe for head trauma. You do this by hitting the skull with a hard object, scissors or the like. A hollow sound is normal, but a dull sound indicates trauma. One of the other students did this exam and found a dull sound. The coroner had not yet himself examined the person and was very surprised, as he had not been informed by the police of head trauma. They then continued to examine the head, and they found a gunshot wound through the skull. All of a sudden, the person was a crime scene, and they had to call the police again and leave the person as untouched as possible. I believe it was later confirmed that the person had shot himself, but it could have been a murder. Med student almost graduated here. A couple years ago, I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class, the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4 out of 5 consecutive autopsies, one of them was carried out on a homeless patient that died in the ER, probably due to heart failure. The body had massive ascites, fluid in the abdomen, so at first he had to evacuate it. Imagine him cutting the abdomen, and the yellow, rancid liquid started to come out like a fountain. One of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease, and the liver and kidneys were full of cysts. The liver weighed more than 10 kilograms, normal weight 2 to 3 kilos, and the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normally 150 grams each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts in order to get samples. They popped like air ball, spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. The other ones were pretty standard, but I think I'll remember forever this one. In particular, that liver on the scale. I even took a picture, but I can't find it anymore. P.S. I'm sorry for any mistakes, but I'm not a native English speaker.